The subcommittee on joint capital outlay will come to order. Will the clerk please take attendance?
Chair Price.
Here.
Representatives Stackloff. Brixey. Here. O'Neill. Hurry. Wilson. Alexander.
Here.
Slaw. Steele. Here. Senators McDonald-Rivet. Irwin. Here. McCann. McMorrow. Camilleri. Here. Santana. DeMoose. Here. Bumstead. Here. Huizinga. Here. Madam Chair, you do have a quorum.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. This is the first lease agreement that we're seeing on this session. This is one of our responsibilities for joint capital outlay, that if a base cost of a proposed lease is more than $500,000, approval of joint capital outlay subcommittee is required prior to the board approval. So we invited representatives from the Department of Technology Management and Budget to come and give us an overview of the lease process. And this, again, will apply to all of the lease agreements that we see. And then we do have a specific lease agreement in front of us today, so we will also have a presentation from Department of Corrections for that proposed lease agreement. Let's see, we got Senator Irwin moves to adopt the minutes from the May 17th meeting without objection, so ordered. The minutes are adopted. And I'd like to invite our representatives from the Department of Technology Management and Budget and the Michigan Department of Corrections to come on up for our presentations. I know that there are some questions about this proposal, and I'm just going to wait and save all questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
All right, Chairwoman Price and members of the subcommittee, thank you for having us here today. We're here, as was mentioned already, to present some information on a lease renewal for the Department of Corrections in a property in Detroit that is critical to their operations in Detroit. So I have with us today, first off, I'm Kayla Boos. I'm the Chief Deputy Director of DTMB. And I also brought Thomas Fehrenbach, who is the Real Estate Director, Kayla Riley down on the end there, who is the real estate leasing manager for the department. And then from the Department of Corrections, we have Julie Hamp, who is the procurement monitoring and compliance division director for the department. And I'm going to turn things over to them. They are the experts in the room. So I'm going to we have a short presentation, and then we'd be happy to answer any questions you have at the end. So Tom, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Boos, and hello to the chairwoman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Tom Fehrenbach. I'm the director of the real estate division for DTMB. Today, we wanted to give you just a brief overview of what our process entails in terms of the leases that we manage on behalf of the state, and then get into a presentation of the specific lease that is the subject of our request today, both in terms of the details related to the lease itself, as well as some of the operational considerations. And then we'd look to the committee for any questions that you have, and ultimately for consideration. So in terms of our leasing process, this is a very succinct overview of what is a very robust process. Essentially, it starts with a request from one of the agencies which we view as our partners. We do a very thorough review of the request. We try to determine whether it can be supported using state-owned property, and many other factors are considered. Ultimately...
So sorry to interrupt, just we're having a little trouble hearing you. Can you pull the mic a little closer?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Let's see if I can get a little closer. Maybe this mic.
Okay.
Is this better?
Yes,
okay,
thank you.
Great. So as I noted, we have a very robust process, and it begins with a request from one of our agency partners. We review that request through a multi-factor lens, ultimately including looking at state-owned properties and whether we can satisfy the request there. We then begin reviewing some of the draft terms, and obtain the proposals from lessors through a RFP process. We review these also through a very robust process, including a market analysis through our expert opinions using software and our vast knowledge of current leases that we have in our portfolio. We then would draft through the negotiation process a lease form which then would need to be reviewed by the Attorney General's office in terms of its legal form, as well as by our team and the AG's office to determine that it meets the standards of PA 431 of 1984, which is the Management and Budget Act. From that point on, we are in the approval process, and that is why we're here today, because that standard that the chairwoman mentioned at the outset of the meeting, if it's a $500,000 of an annual base lease or more, it needs to come to this subcommittee for approval. From here, if approved, we would then head on to the building committee and the state administrative board for approvals, and ultimately the DTMB director is the final stop on that train. So in terms of the different types of cancellations, these are typically a function of investments that are made upfront, and so we can talk more about that if the committee is interested. But essentially, there's a standard cancellation. Any cancellation through the state constitution is required. We're required to have that language and that ability as the lessee. So we have a standard cancellation, which is really our standard, and it requires only notice of 30 or so days, and is a very simple process, leading up to our most restrictive, which would be the legislative cancel, which required an act of legislation. There's various standards in between, and again, these are negotiated based on the type of investment that's typically made upfront on the front end of a lease by the lessor. So in terms of the details, I'll just walk you through these briefly. We do have the subject matter expert here from DOC. This is a renewal of an existing lease. It's about 38,500 square feet total, with 2,300 of it being garage spaces that we use for automobiles. The rental rate is a base of $21.63 plus around $6 for the garage space for the initial 10-year term. It is important to note that corrections will pay for janitorial services and supplies, public utilities, and pest control directly. This is a 10-year initial lease renewal with 2 5-year options. There is a $750,000 investment on the front end by the lessor, and therefore we've negotiated an executive cancellation with 180 days notice for the first 10-year initial term, and then sunsetting into the standard cancellation in the renewal options if they're exercised. So in terms of operational considerations, this is one of 2 locations of parole offices in the Detroit, Wayne County region. It's the only parole office in Detroit. There's currently 143 full-time equivalent employees authorized at the location. MDOC is researching capacity for additional offices to be located there. Currently, we're servicing 1,819 parolees at this location, and we have other important uses for the space, including the administrative offices for prison reentry, administrative investigative offices, and conferences and trainings take place, as well as the storage of the 8 state vehicles that I mentioned earlier. So in terms of the consideration we're requesting today from the subcommittee, it's simply to approve the lease agreement number 10965 at the 5300 Lawton address in Detroit. And with that, we'd be happy to take any questions that you have. Again, we have subject matter on the leasing side, subject matter expert on the correction side, and we're happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much for that very succinct and clear presentation. I wonder if we have questions, outstanding questions from our committee members. Senator Heisinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your presentation today. Can you give us a little bit of background on the decision of lease versus buy? And although when I look at the space on paper, it seems reasonable, but a quick Google Maps look, it's not exactly probably Class B or Class even C type building. Has there been any consideration for lease versus buy and what the alternatives might be in for something like this?
Thank you for your question. In this particular instance, we have chosen to just renew the option as a lease renewal. We have been in there for 20 years prior to this, and this is just renewing this at the same space. Currently with this landlord, with the history, we have been within market value of all of the entire lease this entire time, and then even when we had any sort of recessions or asked for rate reductions, the landlord's been really willing to work with us throughout the history of this lease, and that is why we've also considered just staying here from a lease perspective.
So just to be clear, you didn't take any consideration about any alternative space for ownership?
Correct.
Thank you. Rep. Slaw.
Just piggybacking off of that question, as I look at the materials that were handed out, it doesn't look like we've actually bid this kind of space need against really what's available in the market since 20 years ago. Is that correct? So we haven't done a rebid looking for space. Yes? No?
That's correct, and I'm sorry, I misspoke in the process. That's, the RFP process is for our typical lease process. This being a renewal, that affords us the ability to negotiate directly with the existing lessor. And again, that market analysis component that we go through that process allows us to ensure that we're at or below market rate, which we certainly are in this case.
Secondary question, I saw that in your numbers out that you had displayed 143 FTEs is what's authorized. I'd be really interested to know who's actually showing up on a daily basis. Because as I talk to folks downtown here, there may be lots of folks that we've actually still got employed in the state government, but they're not here. They're not supporting the businesses downtown. So obviously that changed over time, and they've not come back because the numbers aren't there for the local people. How many people are actually in the office on a daily basis?
Thank you for your question. Right now, we have the staff that work 1 day a week in the office, but we have several that are in the office more than 1 day a week, and then we also have some of those that work in the office every day. So they have the option to choose remote work. The department has been discussing changing those requirements at various times. So we know that our work from home opportunities are at the discretion of our Director Heidi Washington, and those could change at any point in time. So right now they're working in the office at least 1 day per week. Some work multiple days per week, and then there are others that are there full time.
So wondering about what the office is actually, that space is actually configured for. How many workers would it actually hold, and how many are actually showing up on a day on average?
I don't have access to that information, at least not in front of me right now. We could prepare that.
Thank you. And if you send that to my office, I'm happy to share that out with all members of the group. Senator McDonald-Brevet.
First, let me apologize for my lateness. Orange barrels caused a bit of a problem this morning. Do you have an estimate of what the cost would be to move to a different facility?
That's not something we have prepared in front of us today. But
I'm just trying to get an understanding of, so I think it's a valid question of did you look to see if there was anything else, but that's not a free thing to do, to move an office building from one part of the city to the other. So I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about that to get further context.
Yeah, absolutely. So generally, in our leasing process, we start looking at leases 18 months in advance of expiration, and a lot of that is related to the RFP process, so we can receive bids, receive proposals, work our way through negotiations and that sort of thing to not hinder our previous lease terms. With that, 18 months also includes construction, any sort of that sort of thing. So generally, when looking at new leases, there is the moving cost for the department, but then there's also the build-out and construction costs for whatever that scope of work may be, for whatever the specific business needs are for that agency. But that is really dependent on the department's requirements and what they're utilizing that space for, as well as I would say, geography and location of those locations, as well as timelines for constructions and logistics.
I do have more questions. I am going to take personal privilege as a chair to insert one of my own. I'd like you to speak a little bit about some of the unique factors with the use of this location and relocating to other sites. So, Ms. Hamp, would you address that, please? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's difficult to find office space for parole offices that neighboring businesses want to share with us. So when we do find location that is very amenable and accessible to not only our parole agents and our parolees who have to travel there, there has to be access from public transportation for them to get to these locations. And then the clientele, oftentimes, it can be difficult to share space with other business areas. So when we finally find a location that we have a great landlord, we have good space, we like to stay and utilize that space as much as we can.
Thank you for sharing some of those additional considerations. Rep. Sutcliffe?
Thank you, Chair Price. Thank you for being with us this morning. Just a quick question about the rate calculation sheet. I just want to make sure I have the correct understanding. We can do a 10-year lease or an option for a 5-year with a renewal, or is it a 10-year and we have 2 options for renewal? And what's the difference between, the costs are very different between renewal option 1 and renewal option 2. So just want to see what those differences are. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So the lease is negotiated, or right now, with a 10-year initial term and 2 renewal options that are already established in the lease. So when the 10-year term expires, or when it comes to fruition, we have the option to renew an option number 1 and option number 2. The reason for the rate increase is a lot to do with inflation, property taxes, things along those lines that the landlord is projecting in the future.
The 2 renewal options, though, have different costs for square footage.
Correct, and that is their increase. So a lot of, with the majority of our leases, we, working with our landlords, they're looking at a 2 to 3% annual increase, and that is to cover their expenses. So in this particular lease, corrections is responsible for public utilities, janitorial, and pest control. However, the landlord is still responsible for like property taxes, ground maintenance, general maintenance, that sort of thing. So they factor that into the consideration just based on cost and what they think their cost is to maintain the building.
So just so I'm understanding, so we're kind of looking at 20 years then with 2 5-year renewals?
Only if we choose to renew those options.
Okay, got
So
it.
that's our choice.
Got it, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Irwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question for DTMB. Do you have any sort of standard rubric that you apply when analyzing these types of needs, where you look at how much square footage is needed per employee? And did you do that on this particular site? And if you did, I guess tying into Rep. Slaw's question, did you sort of assume that those 143 folks would be there full-time? And if so, you know, are we looking at roughly 253 square foot per employee, or is there something else going on in this facility that changed that?
So DTMB they officiate the building standards, and that's something that all the agencies use, and that is for like cubicle sizes, hoteling stations, conferencing, things along those lines that are distributed and utilized for all the departments. The square footage in here, as they mentioned, there's also conference rooms, floor-to-ceiling offices, so it really just depends on the classifications of employees, I guess, in terms of the square footage distribution. But all of the departments utilize the DTMB standards for space and occupancy, or should be, as they're programming their space.
So as a quick follow-up, is embedded in that answer a commentary saying that, yeah, we looked at this space and it's actually not 253 square feet per employee. It's actually that they've got all this common space and that's appropriate in this particular instance because of the needs of MDOC?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rep. O'Neill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of my questions have been kind of alluded to. Just understanding the fact this is a renewal and you've been there already, and you referenced the uniqueness of corrections, which it is. You know, having neighbors that will be amenable to support what you're doing in its ins and outs of the clients, and you talked about reentry services being, you know, as a part of this platform. So I just want you to just kind of, if you just briefly elaborate on how important and unique the services are that the building space is utilized for, and how that makes it really important that you maintain consistency location, because you got variances, you got zoning, you got all these factors you got to consider when you're dealing with corrections and those inmates coming back into your facility and for services.
Thank you. I'm happy to answer that question. So our reentry processes, as they apply to our parolee population, you can imagine a parolee would come in and it's almost like a twofold reporting day. So he or she might meet with their agent first and talk about the terms of their parole. But they're also going to meet with a reentry services agent, and that person is really designed to help them get the things that they need, get them assigned to various programs. If there are transportation issues or housing issues, maybe they need clothing. So our reentry specialists that also work in that area, they meet with those parolees at the same time. Also within that same reporting category, based on their classification, they may have to do some oral drug testing, drug or alcohol testing when they come in for that visit. So the stability of the place, as you mentioned, Representative, is very important. So when our parolees, they know when to come, they know what to expect, and they're going to meet with various people when they come in for that report day.
Thank you. Senator DeMoose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two quick questions. One of them is, and I don't doubt the importance of the work that's occurring there, certainly you know that, but this is a discussion about the building. So this is a 28% rate increase, which in this sort of climate where office space is going down and these type of things, have you done a market study to find out whether that's feasible or whether that's fair? And then I have another follow-up after that.
Yes. So we, for DTMB and how we do our negotiation market analysis process, we look at our current lease portfolio, which is roughly 460 leases, and then we also look at the leases we have in that area and what we spend. We also use an industry standard called CoStar, which is a commercial real estate management tool, so we can look at the market trends within that area. So we actually did pull a CoStar report, right, and we have that here. So it's actually a gross lease is roughly $23 a square foot, which falls in line with what their $21.63 renewal proposal entails.
Okay, so but have you done a historical study? I mean, are all of these rising at the same price here? I mean, 28% is a lot.
So most of our leases, when we do renewals, they are at an increased rate. It is very rare that we are getting them at the same rate or at a lesser amount. A lot of it has to do with the services that they provide and the type of lease. If it's a gross lease and the landlord's responsible for, like utilities, janitorial, grounds, maintenance, that sort of thing. So construction costs, maintenance costs, all those things we have been seeing follow suit and with our lease proposals from landlords as well.
Okay, so that leads well into my second question, and that is, can you describe the building in a little bit more detail, what it's like inside? Because just looking at some pictures from the outside, it looks like a total mess. I mean, I can't imagine, we have to be able to justify this to people who have entrusted us to care for their money, and I'd hate to show a picture of this building and say, we're paying $800,000 a year for this. Is it better on the inside, or can you describe what we're getting?
Thank you for your question. I have not been inside the building, but I know as part of the lease negotiations, there is going to be updates to the interior of the building. They're going to be painting, they're updating bathrooms, as I understand it. There's going to be new carpet. And then the department has, within our budget appropriations this year, allocated new funds for new cubicles space. That's why we're having the space assessed by DBI, which is one of our state contracts, to ensure that we can get as many office spaces in there as we need, and that the updates of the building are more amenable to the increase in the rate.
Representative Steele.
Thank you. Thank you. My initial question was the lease versus the purchasing. And personally, to dig deeper into that would have been appreciated, just to be able to say, okay, comparatively speaking, like you have a comparative analysis for the actual price, comparing purchasing versus leasing. However, which leads into two different questions. One, this lease, I don't believe, has a lease with an option to purchase, and I know some of our leases do, and I just want to see why that might have been omitted. And my second question is the renovation portion of this lease, where they're going to be doing some renovations. My question, has there been any renovations in the past 20 years that we have leased this? 20 years. And the renovations that they are proposing, how long until they're completed, and have they taken in consideration the new space requirements that we might need based on working from home program? So basically, has there been any renovations? Why don't we have an option to buy? And how long until these renovations are completed? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. From my understanding, there's been minimal renovations up to this point. What we've been looking to renovate, and as Mrs. Hamp had said, is they're looking to do bathroom upgrades, security, drywall, carpet paint, interior lighting upgrades, parking lot infrastructure upgrades, and those sorts of things. To your point of the option to purchase, it was not in the initial lease that we had with them over the last 20 years, and it was not something that we negotiated in with this lease in particular. Usually that would be something that we would have to negotiate with the landlord on if that's something that's of interest.
When will these renovations be completed?
And the renovations will start as soon as this lease get approved through the JOCS committee and the state ad board. So then the lease will be approved and just not rent authorized until all of the work is completed.
And have the renovations taken into consideration the working at home program of how much space is actually needed? So that was my last question.
I think that was the where Ms. Hamp had mentioned that they have DBI working on the configurations and what that would look like. That would be that component of it in terms of how they utilize that space, whether there's hoteling, offices, how everyone occupies. Correct.
Okay, and one final question. Would just love you to make it clear, why now? Why is this coming before us now? How does the timeline impacted by our decision today? Yes.
Okay, thank you for your question. So our original lease that we're currently in, it expires at the end of August. So the reason for bringing it to the JOCS committee is we would like to renew the lease prior to our current lease expiring at the end of August. So that is the timeline for the purpose of this meeting. We also then, as Tom had mentioned, after the JOCS committee, we still have to take it to the building committee, state ad board approval, which are also scheduled dates as well. So from a timeline perspective, we're looking for approval on this lease renewal and then also getting it through the final approval phases before the current lease that we are in expires at the end of August.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, Representative O'Neill moves to approve lease 10965-2023 for the Department of Corrections. Will the clerk please call the roll?
On the motion to approve, Chair Price,
Yes.
Representatives Steckloff. Yes. Brixey. Yes. O'Neill. Yes. Hurry. Wilson. Yes. Alexander.
Yes.
Slaw. Steele. Yes. Senators McDonald Rivet.
Yes.
Irwin. Yes. McCann. Yes. McMorrow. Yes. Camilleri. Yes. Santana. Yes. DeMoose. No. Bumstead. No. Heisinger. No. Madam Chair, you have 13 yeas, 3 nays, 1 pass. The motion prevails.
Okay. Thank you. And Senator McDonald Rivet, the lease is approved. Thank you. And Senator McDonald Rivet moves to excuse absent members without objection, so ordered. There being no further business, the subcommittee will stand adjourned.